There are people who followed the rules. They went to therapy, they took the medications, they showed up, and they tried. And they're still carrying it, still waking up in it, still reliving it, still managing, not healing. Now, here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Some of those same people, after everything failed, left the country, sat in a controlled setting, and experienced more relief in a few days than they had in years of treatment. Not cured, but changed. And instead of asking, what can we learn from this? We ask, why were they there? Why is that illegal? Why isn't that available here? That's the wrong question. The real question is, why did they have to leave in the first place? This is The Forge. What's up, guys? Tyler here from The Forge. I am Tyler Van Allen, licensed trauma-informed therapist specializing in veterans and first responders, and this is the place where real truth is spoken about mental health for you guys and gals with none of the fluff, none of the filler, right? So today is not about promotion, all right? This is not about promotion, and it's not about telling you to go do anything. That is not what we're doing here. As you can probably tell by the title of this episode, illegal healing. That's what we're getting into today, right? Illegal healing. As a licensed therapist, number one, I'm not your therapist. Number two, I'm here to give you some information, and you are the expert of your life, and you can do what you want. This is not me telling you anything about what you should and should not do. This is about giving you some, again, real information so you can make some of these informed decisions on your own. So again, today is not about telling you to go do anything. Today, it's about confronting something real, right? Confronting some real things. And there are emerging treatments backed by growing research that exists outside the system, right? The system. Ooh, yeah, the system. And the system has not caught up with any of this. That's the problem, right? So we're going to talk about the neurobiology. You know me, I love the neuro stuff. We're going to talk about the research. We're going to get into the real world applications. Some of you who have Netflix, you may have seen the documentary on Netflix called Waves in War that talk about some of the illegal sides of healing, and specifically healing PTSD and my vets and first responders out there. And also, we're going to address the uncomfortable reality of why access is still restricted. That could be a whole episode of me just bitching and complaining about this, but that's okay. We'll get into it. Right? So let's be clear about something. Traditional treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, traditional treatment helps a lot of people. It really does. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't believe in the treatments that I provide for people. I would not be doing this work. But let's be clear. Traditional treatments do not help everyone. And I might be the only therapist on the face of the earth that's ever said that. But traditional treatments don't help everyone. A statistic that most of us, I'm sure, have not heard, but roughly about 1/3, I think it is, of depression cases are treatment resistant. And that doesn't mean that traditional treatment is not helpful, but 1/3 of depression cases are treatment resistant. And PTSD, especially in vets and first responders, often becomes chronic, right? It becomes chronic. It's a chronic issue. So you can understand your trauma and you can talk through it, and hell, you can medicate it and still feel like your nervous system never rests, right? That's a real thing that can really happen. And because trauma, it's not just cognitive, right? It's not just the space between our ears. It's encoded, right? It's encoded, as we've talked about before. It's encoded in the amygdala, which is our threat detection. It's encoded in the hippocampus, which is our memory integration. The autonomic nervous system, right? Our fight, flight baseline. You don't just think trauma. You live in it, right? You live in it. This is not just about thoughts and a will of the mind. It's not. So, what kind of got me started on this topic here. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. Came across a documentary on Netflix a while back, and it's called Waves and War. And Waves and War doesn't really present a theory. It shows a reality, right? It shows a reality. Man, I was there just watching this documentary, and next thing I know, tears are just flowing. Happy tears, just happy tears. Like, holy cow! Like this is real. This is real treatment. This is really effective treatment for some individuals, right? So, Waves and War, it shows reality, and veterans, many with severe PTSD, it shows them traveling outside the U.S. to access treatments that they cannot legally receive at home. Can't receive it. Not here in the U.S. Not right now, anyways. And some of those treatments include utilizing substances that are psychoactive, right? Psychoactive substances. One in particular that was in Waves and War is called ibogaine. And ibogaine is a psychoactive alkaloid that's derived from the iboga plant. It is used in some clinics, but primarily outside the United States. And ibogaine has been used for addiction, trauma processing. And ibogaine, in like a neurobio sense, it acts on multiple systems. So it is a chemical that's really working with a bunch of different systems, serotonin, dopamine, NMDA receptors, right? And we'll get into all this. You don't have to remember this. There's no tests at the end of this. So ibogaine acts on multiple systems. And there's been research out there that I've found. And ibogaine may reset certain addictive and compulsive patterns. Pretty awesome. Pretty awesome. Another one that was featured in this documentary is 5-MeO-DMT. And we all know mostly what DMT is. We know likely where it comes from, but DMT is a very fast acting and extremely potent psychedelic. And some of the reported effects from the 5-MeO-DMT, this rapid ego dissolution, right? So our ego dies, ego death, and for those of us who don't really understand ego, ego is not just this thing that exists inside of us where we're just like, oh man, I'm the coolest guy around. I'm the best that there ever was and ever will be. Ego is that part in our mind that protects us emotionally. That's what our ego does. It is a protective system. It protects us emotionally. And so, this chemical kind of helps to break down that ego, right? So if you can think of the ego as something that's protecting you, if we need to recall some traumatic experiences and memories, in a very elementary explanation here, if we need to recall some of these memories, these experiences, to process them out, sometimes our ego just simply won't allow it because they're just so damn painful, right? In a simple sense, they're so painful. And in addition to the 5-MeO DMT, another reported effect is like this intense emotional release, right? And profound shifts in self-perception. Again, we will get into some of this a little bit more, but some participants in this documentary described sort of an immediate reduction in depressive symptoms. And not for nothing, but after about one treatment, man. And again, like, I don't want to pitch this stuff as being some kind of miracle treatment because, hey, not everything works for everybody. It really does not. And you have to understand that there are certainly some serious risks that come along with some of these treatments. They're not just a one and done. They're not just something that's just perfect for everybody. But yeah, an immediate reduction in depressive symptoms and also a sense of reset in identity and fear processing. Can you imagine for a second if you could just push a reset button on your identity and fear processing as it has been formulated based on your traumatic experiences? That is wild, dude. That is wild, right? That's wild. So another substance that we all have kind of heard about before is psilocybin, right? Mushrooms and ayahuasca. And there's a little bit of a contextual overlap there, right? So also represented in broader psychedelic therapy conversations. Psilocybin ayahuasca type treatments can really help to access deep emotions, really help facilitate trauma processing. And the most important part is reconstructing meaning of these experiences, right? And what Waves and War highlights is not just the substances, it's the pattern, right? It's the pattern. People who exhausted every conventional option, finding something that finally moves the system, right? That finally moves this nervous system in the direction that it needs to go in. And so Stanford University took part in this documentary. And this is the part I think that makes it just completely legit. I mean, it's not for nothing. The Stanford piece in Waves and War centers on early clinical research into psychedelic-assisted therapy for vets with PTSD, depression, and even some of those guys with traumatic brain injury, right? Specifically using ibogaine and then following that up with a treatment of 5-MeO DMT. So the Stanford research team that was in this documentary, the work highlighted in the film is associated with researchers at Stanford, and particularly a couple of researchers that I really dig their stuff is Nolan Williams. So Dr. Williams, he's practices psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and Alan Schatzberg, senior figure in mood disorder research, right? So these guys weren't just some kooky hippies out there that was like, oh, I just want to study the effects of drugs on the mind. Like, no, these guys are very much rooted in behavioral science and mood disorder research. And what they were actually studying, right? This wasn't the treatment happening necessarily on site at Stanford. Instead, Stanford researchers were tracking outcomes from veterans treated abroad, right, in some cases. So veterans went to clinics, and I think in the documentary it was mainly in Mexico, just a little south of Tijuana. Um, and they were tracking vets who went to clinics for ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT. And Stanford collected before and after data, right? And it wasn't just like, hey, how you feeling before, how you feeling after. There was some science behind this, right? Um, and specifically, they were measuring symptom changes. So they looked at PTSD severity. They looked at depression. They looked at anxiety. They looked at cognitive function, especially in the TBI cases, right? The traumatic brain injury cases. So they kind of really took a deep dive on this. But most importantly, they were observing, neurological impact, right? So the research explores how these substances, um, you know, may reset dysfunctional brain networks, right? They were really trying to study, is there an increase in neuroplasticity? In other words, your brain's ability to rewire itself. And they were studying, can these substances disrupt this rigid trauma loop, right? This default mode network involvement. And again, we will certainly get into a lot of this stuff in a little bit more detail. So yeah, I mean, these were some pretty legit studies that, not for nothing, showed a whole lot of promise, and not even promise, had some pretty significant results. So the question I kind of came up with is, why are they looking at ibogaine in plus the 5-MeO-DMT? Why is that so unique, right? Why is that unique? Well, the protocol shown is pretty intentional, right? It's pretty intentional. So ibogaine is a long, intense experience, right? And it's often 12 to 24 hours. And that chemical is really associated with deep autobiographical processing. And that's important to know, right? So the ibogaine is really the deep autobiographical processing. The 5-MeO-DMT, now that is short. That is a very short-lived experience. But it's extremely powerful in that ego dissolving process, right? In that ego dissolving experience. So often described as producing a sense of unity or reset, right? And so Stanford researchers, they were interested in whether this sequence creates a rapid, durable reduction in symptoms, especially for people who didn't respond to traditional SSRIs or traditional therapy, right? And what they found, early findings in small observational studies, they found large drops in PTSD and depression scores using assessments. And some participants reported near immediate relief, like near immediate relief. And these effects lasted weeks to months. And in all honesty, it's still being studied long term. But this really matters, though, right? So it kind of sounds like I'm selling this, but this part matters, right? This is still preliminary. This is still preliminary research. And also, it's important to note out that these are small sample sizes, right? We're talking about, I don't know, anywhere to probably no more than 50, maybe 100 at most, individuals. So these are small sample sizes, and they're not yet FDA approved treatment. Not yet FDA approved. Whatever. We'll talk about that a little bit more. I'm going to have to stand on my soapbox at some point. You know me. I'm going to have to do that. Yeah. So you know me. We're going to have to get into the neurobiology of this. I'm a nerd, man. I'm a nerd. I can't help it. I love how this stuff works. And that's the thing. Like, it's not just nerdy. Like, you got to know how this stuff works, because, for me, in just simple terms, like knowing that this stuff, how it really affects our brain and our system, to me, gives me belief in it, right? Like I need to know that this is not just something that someone's just conjuring out of thin air. Like I need to know the process. I need to know how this is working, right? So here's what these substances tend to have in common, right? Number one, you heard me say it earlier before, this default mode network disruption, right? What the hell is that? Excuse me. The default mode network disruption. So DMN, default mode network, is associated with identity, rumination, and these narrative loops, right? These stories that we keep telling ourselves, right? And in trauma and depression, the default mode network becomes so rigid. And what I mean by rigid is that it is hard to break that trauma identity. It's hard to break that rumination of those thoughts. And it's hard to break that narrative loop that just keeps replaying over and over and over again, right? So that default mode network is very rigid. I found a pretty cool piece of research by this cat, Robin Carhart Harris, who shows that psychedelics decrease default mode network activity. So what does that mean? Well, if we decrease our default mode network activity, that can allow for reduced rumination, that can increase cognitive flexibility, and that really kind of allows new perspectives on ourself, right? Ourself as we see us. Also, additional studies by this guy Lai. Sorry, I said guy. I don't really know if you're a male or female. In this journal called Cell Reports in 2018, their studies showed that, there was this surge in neuroplasticity. There was this increase in dendritic growth. There was enhanced synaptic connections. What does that mean? I love those words, but for those who hate those words, what does that mean? What that means is the brain becomes more capable of rewiring itself. It just becomes a better electrician to go in, rip out the old stuff, put in some new stuff, and makes this processing function a lot, I won't say easier, but a lot more efficient. Maybe efficiency is the right word. So, also, when we try to access some of these emotions that we feel from traumatic experiences, especially PTSD, depression, anxiety, those type of things, typically, again, the ego shows up and the ego wants to protect us. The ego is going to protect us by engaging in avoidance. So under normal conditions, right, the brain, it wants to avoid painful memories. But under psychedelic states, defensive barriers are reduced and emotional material becomes more easily accessible. And this allows reprocessing instead of suppression. And it also kind of helps with the integration instead of avoidance, right? When I am doing EMDR therapy on vets and first responders, right, there is a whole process of EMDR therapy, a whole step that deals in safety and resourcing, right? Safety and resourcing essentially helps us to lead a client into a state where, they are engaged in EMDR without dissociation. We call that past present processing. We're trying to kind of loop around the ego so that you're not sitting there recalling things and just dissociating out. Because if you're dissociating out, you're not connecting. You're not you're not accessing those emotions that kind of help that process start. So in EMDR, there are protocols for that, but now we're talking about chemicals. We're talking about psychedelics that sort of help bypass all of that altogether, right? So I feel like that's a pretty important distinction there. And finally, what we're also looking at is this thing called fear response modulation. So some research suggests psychedelics may reduce amygdala reactivity and help increase emotional tolerance, right? Which is critical in PTSD. So kind of back to that Amy in our brain, right? Like that little piece in our brain that's just like this threat detector that's just going haywire, right? You know, oftentimes when we are recalling traumatic experiences, and unfortunately, sometimes we do need to recall them to a certain degree. That might not be telling the whole narrative, but that might be, uh, conjuring up those thoughts related to that experience, conjuring up those somatic symptoms, those body feelings. Um, Man, that amygdala is going to activate. Didn't matter if it happened 10 years ago or today. That amygdala is going to activate, right? So this fear response, to be able to modulate that, that's pretty critical, I think, in PTSD healing, in the healing of PTSD. So yeah, a lot of pretty awesome stuff. I know these are big words. Like I said, there's a lot to unpack here. I will just remind you right now that, like, please leave questions in the comments below. I will certainly get back to them. Shoot me an email, leave questions. Please. This is not something that maybe you can just sit and listen through at once. There's a lot of stuff to talk about here, right? A lot of stuff to talk about. So, where would we be? We got all these words, we got all these studies, but we got to get into the data here a little bit. And the data, these aren't just stories, right? This is not just stories. Let's ground this for a second. Let's really ground this for a second. Some data. Roland Griffith from Johns Hopkins, right? They pretty much paved that way that said psilocybin is a significant reduction in depressive symptoms, right? That was in a psychiatry journal, the JAMA journal, from 2024, or I'm sorry, 2020. And then we have this, let's see, this author, Maps. They primarily focused on MDMA assisted therapy, right? Their data came back where they had found 67% no longer met PTSD criteria. And that was found in the Nature Medicine journal in 2021. Davis, also a part of the JAMA psychiatry, discovered that rapid antidepressant effects were seen from psilocybin, right? And I know I'm just giving you, like, not even cliff notes of some of these things. I'll put a link to this research in the description, so that you can go and check it out yourself. But listen, these are not fringe journals. These are not journals that just occur in the dark corners of the internet. This is mainstream peer-reviewed stuff. And for those of you who aren't in the science community, who aren't in the mental health community, peer-reviewed studies are essentially, let's just say you're doing a study on something and you generate your data and you find your conclusions and your findings and you put it out there. Peer-reviewed studies are basically studies that are put in front of experts in that field, and their job is to poke holes in it and find out every reason in the world why you were wrong. That's basically what peer review means. You're reviewed by people of your peers that are essentially looking to ensure that what you found actually is what you found, right? So peer-reviewed studies are super important. Super important, right? So if these are not fringe journals, And if we are starting to see that the efficacy of these psychedelic treatments actually work, and they work really well, then what's the problem here? What's the problem, right? The system is the problem. And I don't mean our system. I mean the system of government for which we live in. And I couldn't wait to get to this part because I can't wait to bash the hell out of this. So we have to ask ourselves the uncomfortable question, right? If the data exists, which it does, if the need exists, which it does, if people are already seeking this out, regardless of its legalities, which they are, why is access still so damn limited? Why? Why is access so limited? Well, for one, there's such a legal lag in the scientific movement, right? And we'll start with Schedule 1 classification of drugs, right? And it still applies to many psychedelics. But as I pulled that definition, what does a Schedule 1 classification actually mean? Well, when something is a Schedule 1 classified substance, that means that your government has determined that there is no accepted medical use and that there is a high abuse potential. Wow. Right. No accepted medical use and a high abuse potential. But, research now shows potential therapeutic use, right? And I could go on for 2 hours about the amount of medication that your doctor could prescribe you right now that has insanely high abuse potential. That's out there right now. Big Pharma is pushing right now. So the classification of Schedule 1, it is outdated, man. It is outdated. And, partially because of this historical overcorrection, right? The backlash from the 60s wasn't purely scientific. It was cultural, man. It was political. And policy froze research for decades. Right? As soon as something got a Schedule 1 classification, there is no research possibilities at all for some of those things. And because of that historical overcorrection, we're still catching up right now. We're still catching up. Finally, some limitations have been lifted for universities and, really big brainiacs to be able to dive into some of these substances and say, hey, I wonder if this stuff actually works, and doing it in a way that is moral, ethical, and safe, which, hey, that's what it's all about. But if we can acknowledge there's a legal lag in the scientific movement, and we can acknowledge the reason for that legal lag is because we're stuck in the past, then that also takes us to probably, in my opinion, the biggest point of contention. And that is economic friction. Economic friction. What are we talking about here? When we see data using psychedelic treatment, where's the economic friction there? Well, here's a difficult truth. Treatments that require 1 to 3 sessions, treatments that don't rely on daily use, and treatments that don't fit traditional pharmaceutical models. And I'm not trying to go into this big conspiracy theory here, because that's not what this show is about. But it certainly points to a misalignment of incentives. My role as a therapist is every time I see you, I try to work as hard as I can to put myself out of a job. In other words, I don't want you to be in therapy forever. I don't want you to need me forever. I don't want to give you tools that you can only use in the presence of me. That is immoral. That is unethical, right? To offer you something that only I can give you and you can only use if I give it to you, and you can't just replenish it on your own. Psychopharm companies, they do this all the time, right? Insurance is a business. Psychopharm, big pharma is a business. The corporate cartel, man, they are a business, right? So, you know, insurance companies, they make money off of your premiums, and, you're going to keep up with those premiums because you're going to need to be in therapy for a little while. You're going to need SSRIs for the rest of your life, or at least sometimes that's what certain people push. Yeah, it's a part of the system. It's a part of this economic system that make money, right? And I'm not trying to say that, I believe in this conspiracy where there are no cures because there's no money in cures, but believe me, there's some very powerful men in the boardroom that, if legislation was passed for some of these treatments to be accessible to you, their pocketbooks would get a lot smaller. Their pocketbooks would get a lot smaller. I mean, if I don't have to go and get a script every month, every 30 days, every 90 days, I have to take a hard look in the mirror if I'm in charge of one of these companies. Because now it's a matter of, do I stay a gojillionaire, or do I allow myself to be of service to humankind and say it doesn't matter about the money. What matters is that people are healing, right? What matters is that people are healing. That's a tough place to be. Wouldn't be a tough place for me to be, but I think it'd be a tough place for a lot of business executives out there, right? It'd be a big, tough place. I could go on about the economic friction forever. It is a bane of my existence. I gotta end it right there. But we're also kind of talking about risk aversion versus human cost, right? And yes, there are risks. I mean, there have been a few people that I've worked with in the past that have actually, when they have experimented using psychedelics on their own, right? No structure to it whatsoever, pure recreation. It's thrusted them into like psychological destabilization, right? The drug out there, K2, yeah, I know at least two individuals that were thrusted into schizophrenia because of K2. That is no lie. That is no lie. You can use these improperly. And also, you can't go out there and just find a bag of mushrooms or take ayahuasca tea without specialized tools or someone specialized to guide you down that path to help you integrate where your mind is kind of headed during this treatment. But there's also risk in doing nothing new. And, really chronic PTSD, suicide rates are through the roof. Long-term suffering. I mean, those are the risks of doing nothing new and trying something, right? I think it was like in the 1970s that before ultrasonography was a thing, they used to x-ray pregnant women's stomachs to determine the position and form of infants in utero, of babies in utero. Wrap your head around that. Shooting radioactive energy into a pregnant woman's belly so that you could get an image of the baby inside of her tummy. Now, I know that sounds stupid right now, right? I know that sounds stupid. But that's what science is, right? That's how you know when science has moved forward, because what seemed rational and logical at the time, as science progresses, we look back on things and we're like, whoa, that was like wildly stupid. But we didn't know any different, right? We didn't have the technology. We didn't have the understanding. Science had not progressed that far. It just simply had not progressed to that point. So, you know, I'm trying to even think, like, sometimes I go off on this crazy existential tangent. But I think a lot about like chemotherapy, like chemical therapy, nuclear medicine. And I'm not knocking it, because trust me, it does save lives. I know it saves lives. But my hope is like one day, like into the future, like we look back on that and we'd be like, wow, like 100 years ago, people used to pump themselves full of like radioactive drugs to like kill cancer. Like, that's wild. Maybe they could just like, why didn't they just like implant some of these cells, right? But that's science, man. Science is crazy sometimes, but think about it. All the things that we use every single day to heal. There had to be that one cat at one time that was like, hey, this really sharp knife? Like, I wonder if I just cut into this person and just look around and just figure out what doesn't look right. And I just take it out and see what happens. Somebody had to do that, right? Um, and so we need those risk takers, right? We also need the people who have been vetted as well as they can be to determine if these treatments are suitable for them. We need that, right? So really, like, the real question becomes, are we protecting people, or are we protecting the system? Are we protecting people, or are we protecting the system? I know what my answer is, but I will not say it on this platform. So, what is missing? What is missing from this discussion today? Well, I'll tell you what's missing is the piece about integration, right? And one of the biggest misconceptions when we are talking about psychedelic treatment for PTSD, one of the biggest misconceptions is that the substance is the treatment. It is not. It is not. DMT is not the treatment. Ayahuasca is not the treatment. Psilocybin is not the treatment. Ibogaine is not the treatment. It's not. It's not at all. The process of these treatments is preparation, experience, and integration, right? Integration. Without integration, the insights that you gain through the assistance of these substances, they will fade and the patterns will return. Sure as shit, those patterns will continue to come back without integration, which is why you can't just sit at home and get in your Zen room and just take these things with no guidance and no help with that integration piece, right? You need that integrative assistance. With integration, these changes become structured and meaning becomes actionable, right? That's so important. That's so important. It kind of goes back to, you can learn all about your trauma, you can understand your trauma, but if you can't integrate the knowledge that you've learned, well, then you just know something, but you got nothing you can do about it, right? You got nothing you can do to keep this knowledge flowing and to convert this from knowledge to action, right? To action. So, at the end of the day, where is this going. We have already seen movement. We've already seen it. We've seen it to some extent, right? We're seeing decriminalization in some regions, right? We're seeing expanded clinical trials, and we're seeing an increase in clinician interest. So this isn't going away. This is not going away. A good friend of mine, Dr. Michelle Perry, she operates Center for Trauma in Bel Air, Maryland. She's doing some pretty cutting edge stuff. So she is certified in psychedelic-assisted treatments, and she hosts ketamine retreats. When I say ketamine retreats, no, I don't mean like going to the club and giving you some ketamine and putting Nelly on and just going buck wild. No. She takes a group of individuals down to Costa Rica, where ketamine treatments are legalized in certain ways. Ketamine treatments are legalized here in the United States, but not in that same way. Her role in these retreats is the integration piece, right? The integration piece. So resources are out there. You just have to find them. You just have to look for them. But there are people that are doing this right now, right? I would give you a word of caution, though, right? You can go on Google and you can search for lots of different psychedelic retreats. And that is all good and fine. But kind of back to waves of war. One of the most important things that I cannot stress enough is that some of the most legitimate retreats for these psychedelic experiences, they have full medical staff there, right? You're not just in a hut with, a guy banging a drum and just hoping for the best. Those are out there too. But you want to vet some of these places if you choose and make the choice to look into this further. I'm not telling you to do it. I would never tell you what to do. I would never tell you to take SSRIs. These are your choices. They're not my choices to impose on you. But I will say, if that is something you're looking to do, there are safer places than others, right? Some of these places require full medical workup before you're even entered into the program. That's important, right? That's important. And thirdly, there are people out there working through sobriety, right? What does that mean in terms of your sobriety, right? Sobriety is a big piece in your life. What does that mean in terms of sobriety? I don't know if that is an actual sciencey question, or is that a question of virtue to yourself? I don't know, right? I do not know. Some people in sobriety, they get injured, they go to the hospital, and they completely refuse the hard pain medication, and that's fine. Others in sobriety, may need that hard pain medication for an injury, a surgery. That is a question that they would talk to with their sponsor about. That is a question that they would talk to their doctors about, with their medical professionals, their medical staff about. That is not something just to enter in lightly, right? That is something to seriously think about. The last thing you want to do is open up a doorway that makes things worse, right? So this is not just one of those decisions where you're like, oh, this would be so awesome, let's just do it. You really need to think about it. You really need to think about it. You really need to do your research. You really need to tap in your medical team, and your group of professionals, right? Your therapists, your psychiatrists, your medical doctors. You need the whole team involved. You really do. So that's pretty important, and I think as we've kind of talked about all of these, just like kind of touching the surface, the question is whether the system adapts or it continues to lag behind the reality on the ground. That is really what we're talking about here. Is this system that we're in ever going to adapt? Or will it always lag behind the reality? The reality that Mother Nature has provided us with almost everything we need, right? Almost everything we need. And us as humans, it is in our nature to complicate it, right? It is in our nature to become gatekeepers to some of these things, right? There are a lot of people out there that they're not virtuous people, right? They're not virtuous people. And that is something that has to change. How that changes, I don't know. I do not know. I do know that change will come when people in power start taking a true moral inventory. That I do believe, right? I definitely believe that people in power start taking a moral inventory of themselves. When people in power start to take a hard look at Big Pharma, right? They start to take a hard look at Big Pharma. If you want the insight on Big Pharma, watch the documentary on Netflix about the birth of OxyContin. Just check that out. If you want to know how most Big Pharma operates, just check that out, right? They're portraying those people as being the worst of the worst. And I'm not saying all Big Pharma is bad, because trust me, there's a lot of smart people out there that's coming up with a lot of really, really amazing medication that's saving lives. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem becomes when the focus is on selling a product and gatekeeping people from that life-saving product, right? Medication is a product. It is a product. You have to see it that way. The drug business is a big business, right? Most things in the United States are illegal, not because they care about you. They're illegal because they haven't figured out how to make money off of it, right? I grew up in South Central Kentucky, where the moonshine is plentiful. Moonshine is illegal because it is alcohol that's not taxed. And in my existential brain, I start thinking about that. And I think to myself, whether it's making your own alcohol at home, whether it's growing your own marijuana plants, I don't know. I'm not saying I'm for illegal, unlawful activity. That's not what I'm getting at. But what I am saying is that if the really smart scientists out there are finding what they're finding, what are we so afraid of? What are we so afraid of? Are we as a system afraid that they're going to find a treatment that puts a lot of people out of business? I don't know. Maybe, right? Maybe. It's quite possible. Yeah. So, psychedelic-assisted treatments are so complex and layered in so many ways, right? And why they're still legal is complex and layered in so many ways. But I think, where I want to close this out, and I think in the future, I'm probably going to do an episode on why this form of treatment is probably not good for you. Because I certainly don't want to come across like this is some kind of miracle cure, or this is good for everybody, because this is certainly not good for everybody. And this is not a miracle cure, right? We are just diving into the early stages of effective tools. So in closing, this isn't about drugs. This is not about drugs and substances. It's about access, and it's about options, right? It's about whether people who are suffering get more than one path without a gatekeeper in their way, right? Psychedelics are not the answer, but they damn well might be part of that answer. They might be. And ignoring that doesn't make the problem go away. It just keeps people stuck. Just keeps people stuck. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. I know this was a whole lot today. Again, shoot me your questions. I'd be happy to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I'll find the answer. I will head you down that path where you can find this knowledge on your own. And, like, what's his name? Lamar Burton, whatever his name from Reading Rainbow. You ain't got to take my word for it. I'm just a guy with a little more than common knowledge on some things, but I'm no expert, you know? I do have a love of research. And so that's what keeps my gears turning. But anyways, thank you so much, guys. Thank you for tuning in. This is The Forge.